So it really is a thrill to be able to share this time with you and to be able to connect together as we connect to God. And we have a special treat today. My friend, Dr. Dan Bouchelle, is here to share a message with you. Now, if you were here or joined in last week, you got to hear a message from Dan, and many of you have told me about how uplifting and inspiring and encouraging that message was as he shared with us some of what God is doing in the world outside of our immediate context, our immediate view, and our local community. And what we discovered through the information Dan shared with us last week and the inspiring news is that the kingdom of God, the redemptive plan of God, is actually making incredible forward progress and advancing exactly as God intends and as God promised, despite what sometimes things might look like in our immediate view. And so that was incredible and meaningful, and so many of you have told me that. You already know that last week's message was fantastic. But honestly, Dan wanted a second chance to talk to you because last week he felt a little bit out of place. He didn't realize that this is a cowboy boot preaching stage. And so last week he wore the wrong shoes, and he's back, and he's got his boots on, and he's ready to try it again. But as he kicks off, I'm going to read a story from the Old Testament, the story that he's going to be preaching from today. And it's one of those stories that's hard. In fact, it's a story that if you've never heard this before, it can be immediately repulsive. But I'm so thrilled Dan's going to share from it today, because what we're going to find is that this is a story about a God who loves us more than we could even ask or imagine. So let me read these words to you from Genesis 22 in the life of Abraham. It said, after the previous events in Abraham's life, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Abraham answered, I'm here. God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burned offering there on one of the mountains that I will show you. Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, together with his son Isaac. He split the wood for the entirely burned offering. He set out, and he went to the place God had described to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place at a distance. And he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk up there and worship and then come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the entirely burned offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father? I'm here, my son. And Isaac said, here's the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the entirely burned offering? And Abraham said, the lamb for the entirely burned offering, God will see to it, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place God had described to him, and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it, and he tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham stretched out his hand, and he took the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. But the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Abraham said, I'm here. And the messenger said, don't stretch out your hand against the young man and don't do anything to him. I now know that you revere God and didn't hold back your son, your only son, from me. Abraham looked up and he saw a single ram caught by its horns in the dense underbrush. Abraham went over, took the ram, and offered it as an entirely burned offering instead of his son. And Abraham named that place, the Lord Sees. That's the reason that today people say, on this mountain, the Lord is seen. The Lord's messenger called out to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I give my word as the Lord, that because you did this and didn't hold back your son, your only son, I will bless you richly, and I will give you countless descendants, as many as the stars in the sky and as the grains of sand on the seashore. They will conquer their enemies' cities, and all the nations of the earth bring us the word, please.
Thank you. Well, it's a blessing to be back with you. I don't usually get to preach a place twice. I used to have one church and many sermons. Now I have one sermon and many churches. So it's a real honor for me to get to preach to you another time. But I will tell you, this is a tough text, and it's a hard word. Do you like that story? Have you read that story? It's profoundly disturbing. When our kids were little, we did Bible stories with them every night, and we decided that we were not going to protect our children from the Bible, even the hard things. And so when our baby, who now is in college, Abby, when she was 5 years old, I was reading her the Bible story of the night, and we came to Genesis 22, and so I told her this story, and she asked me a question at the end of it that I wasn't sure how to answer. She got this worried look on her face, and with very real fear in her voice, she asked, "Daddy, do you think that God would ever ask me to give up Baby Bear?" Now, Baby Bear was her favorite stuffed animal that she'd had since before her first birthday. She slept with him every night. It was her most precious possession. She didn't go anywhere when she was a little kid without Baby Bear, and she sure couldn't go to sleep without Baby Bear. And I was tempted to comfort her and to say, "Oh, don't worry, God's never going to ask you to give up Baby Bear." And I was confident that that was true. I mean, what would God need a stuffed animal for? But I was afraid if I gave her that answer, I would prevent her from hearing the story. This is a story about God asking people to give up something really, really precious. And Abby heard that. She got the meaning of the story. And this is a God who asks his special chosen man to give up something that is more precious than anything else in his life. And the problem wasn't that at 5 years old, Abby didn't understand the story. The problem was at 5 years old, Abby understood the story. She got it all too well. And if God could demand that Abraham would kill his only son, the son that he had promised him and that Abraham had waited 100 years for, and the son that everything in Abraham's life depended on, well then, what might God ask her to give up? You see, Abby at 5 didn't know how to avoid hearing a story she didn't want to hear. We as adults have learned how to kind of rationalize and discount hard stories, but she didn't know how to do that yet. And I don't think there's a more disturbing story in the Bible, and that's saying something, because there are quite a few disturbing stories in the Bible. I mean, this story just doesn't make any sense. I don't care how you slice it. I don't care how you try to rationalize it. This story doesn't make sense. I mean, first we have the appalling problem of human sacrifice. This is simply unthinkable. Is there anything worse than a parent who sacrifices their child? You remember the story of the woman who put her kids in the back seat of the car and drove off into a lake and drowned them? I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, it's horrible. From time to time we hear these stories of people who actually kill their children, or the stories of someone who's so addicted to drugs and they don't have any way to pay for it, and so they prostitute their daughter maybe to buy drugs. And we're just horrified. I just can't imagine such a thing. Is there anything worse than that? Well, I simply cannot imagine tying up one of my children, stabbing them to death, and then burning their body to ashes and watching the whole thing and then saying, "This was my worship to God?" I genuinely would rather go to hell than do that. And this seems so unlike the God that we know anywhere else in Scripture. This is the same God who, when the law of Moses comes along, will absolutely forbid all human sacrifice, will forbid the sacrifice of children. Matter of fact, it was the Canaanites' practice of sacrificing their children to the god Molech that caused God to say, "I'm bringing you, the people of Israel, to wipe out these people because they deserve to be purged from the land." And when the people of Judah, many years later, under King Manasseh, began to pick up the practice of child sacrifice, that's when God said, "I'm done with Judah. I can't protect them anymore." And he let them go into exile and be conquered, and his temple be torn down because they would do such a horrible thing. So how could this same God even think of asking this of Abraham? And how could Abraham think he meant it? But back up a minute. Abraham came before the law of Moses. And Abraham didn't have a Bible, and so he didn't know any of that. This was conceivable to him because in his world, in the world in which he lived, sacrificing your children to a god was not that uncommon. And I know we always want to jump ahead and we want to say, oh, but it's okay because God's going to stop him. God's going to let him do it. It's all going to be okay. But Abraham didn't know that. He hadn't read the Bible. He didn't know this story. So when God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, he thinks he means it. And for 3 days, Abraham believes he's going to have to kill his son Isaac. The next 3 days are a journey to him taking Isaac to the place where he plans to do this. And I'm sure you have never spent 3 days that were more painful and longer than those 3 days were for Abraham. I'm sure Abraham soaked in every moment. This is the third to the last day after I'll lose my son. This is 2 days before I lose my son. This is a day before I'm going to have to kill my son. How he must have agonized over how he would explain this to Sarah. He sure didn't tell her before he left. How's he going to tell her when he gets home? And then when Isaac starts asking questions, how it must have ripped into Abraham's heart when Isaac said, I see the wood and I see the knife and I see the fire. Where is the lamb? And the writer doesn't make it easier. The writer slows down and emphasizes every painful step. Abraham built the altar, stacking the stones. Abraham lays the wood up on the altar. Abraham captures his son, ties his hands and his feet. Isaac is placed on the wood. Abraham raises the knife and is about to plunge it in. What do you think about a God who treats his chosen one this way? I'm sure that Abraham could have afterwards sued God in an American court and gotten a huge settlement for emotional anguish and distress. We just don't believe in our culture that God has the right to demand things like this of us. We think our religion should make our lives better, should reduce our stress, should improve our self-esteem, should expand our territory, should build our brand, and the notion of fearing God seems antiquated. We're beyond that now. Oh, there are some people who used to have that kind of mentality, but my goodness, that kind of judgmental, fearful God, we know better, right? That's an Old Testament God. We don't have a God like that, but we're so now more enlightened. We've learned that Jesus is a servant, right? And we falsely assume that makes faith in God about us and about us getting our will. We think that God's demands should be reasonable, logical, and small. But this is not the God that we encounter in this story, not the God of the Bible. So the first problem of human sacrifice, we just can't find a way around it. But the second problem is that God's demand here contradicts everything else he said to Abraham up to this point, since he called him back in Ur of the Chaldees when God promised him that he would make him a great nation, that he would bless all the nations of the world through him, and he would give him land, and that he would have a son that would be the heir to all of these things. And for 100 years, that's been the plan. God even seems to emphasize this as he speaks to Abraham, your son, your only son, the son you love, Isaac. Every phrase just a little more painful than the one before. God doesn't do anything to cushion the pain and the power of this demand. How could he ask this? Given everything that's happened up till now, all of these years, Abraham following God, leaving his homeland, leaving his home culture, leaving his home language, going without the tribe and the protection of his own people, where he will be an alien in a foreign land, who will be exploited, who will live in perpetual danger because he'll be a threat to all of the nations who have their tribes there, living always as an outsider, insecure, all with the promise that one day his son will inherit this land, that one day all these promises will be fulfilled. God even told him to send Ishmael, his other son, away so he wouldn't be a threat to Isaac. And he did it. He sacrificed the first son for this son. And now he says, sacrifice this son too? Abraham sacrificed his past for God already. Now God's asking him to sacrifice his future? If you don't have a past and you don't have a future, you don't have a present. He sacrificed everything. There's just no making sense of this. And yet Abraham obeys without delay. Early the next morning, after the command comes from God. He doesn't wait around till the afternoon. Early the next morning, he gets up and he heads out with Isaac. Now, the writer doesn't waste any ink telling us how Abraham feels. I mean, how would you even describe that? He only tells us what he did. He obeyed when the command made no sense. And even though Abraham has been at times inconsistent in his faithfulness, especially with regard to Sarah, when he would leave the promised land, which he shouldn't do during a drought, and go down to Egypt where he was away from where God told him to be, and there he's telling lies about who Sarah is for his own protection. Even though Abraham's had his weak moments, even though he's had his inconsistencies, I am in awe of his faith here. And I admit, I wouldn't have done this. I just wouldn't have done it. I want to know what Abraham was thinking. When they arrive at Mount Moriah, where one day Solomon would build the temple and the worship of God would be centered, he tells his servant to stay with the donkeys at the bottom of the mountain, and then he says, we're going to go up and then we will come back, implying that they're both coming back down the mountain. And I'm wondering, is he saying that just not to alarm the servant? Or is he saying that so he won't alarm Isaac? Or did he really expect Isaac to come back down that mountain with him? The writer of Hebrews gives us some idea, perhaps, of what Abraham was thinking. In Hebrews 11, 17 through 19, when he writes, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. For so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. But even here, where we may have a window into Abraham's mind, it sure sounds like Abraham believed he was going to have to kill his son, and that God could raise him later. But how much later? 10 minutes? An hour? 10 hours? A year? 10 years? I don't know. What was it like for Abraham when he had to tie up his son? Did Isaac resist, do you think? Did he put up a fight? How did Abraham explain what he was doing? Did Isaac beg for his life? Did he scream out in terror? Did he say, Daddy, Daddy, what are you doing? Whatever he did, I bet Isaac never let Abraham get in his blind spot again for the rest of his life. You know, he's keeping an eye on Daddy. He knows where he is at all time. I'm not letting him get behind me. Yet all the way through, Abraham trusts God. And the climax of the story is not really the moment when the angel shouts, stop! Or when God says, now I know that you fear God. The climax of the story is in verse 8, when Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And Abraham could only do this because he trusted God's character enough to believe that somehow this would work out without violating God's earlier promises, though he could not explain how. You see, Abraham acted against reason because he had good reason to trust a God who seemed to be asking the unreasonable. But before we fall all over ourselves in admiration for Abraham's faith, we must remember this is not a story about Abraham's faith. It's a story about God's faithfulness. This is a God who demands total allegiance, and he will be satisfied with nothing less. And God is the center of the story. God will not tolerate rivals for our love. He will not tolerate rivals for our loyalty. Because he is God and we are not, he can demand anything from us without having to explain himself to us, and that is unnerving, to say the least. And if that doesn't make you nervous, you're probably not paying attention. And as much as we want to understand God, God always remains to some degree a mystery to us. He is, as the old theologians used to say, ineffable. But what we do know about God gives us reason to trust what we can't know about God. But he is a God who will deliberately put us in difficult positions because he is determined to refine us whether we like it or not. He is determined to reshape us and transform us into the image of Jesus, no matter what it costs us or what it costs him. And refining takes fire, and fire is scary, and fire hurts. And it seems like in this life, it just seems like there are times when God demands more than we can bear. And if you haven't had one of those times, it's coming. God's request of Abraham makes me wonder what I love more. What do I love more, God or the gifts God gives me? Because God has been so good to me. God has given me so many things. God has given me so many blessings. And it's really easy to fall in love with the gifts more than the giver. My greatest temptations to idolatry are to love the gifts that God has given me more than I love God, to worship him for the sake of the blessing rather than to worship him for who he is. That was the temptation of Job, and Satan came to God and said, Job doesn't love you. Job is using you. You bless him. You give him everything. He's on your payroll. You take away all your blessings and you'll find out Job doesn't love you and he won't worship you. And God said, no. I trust Job more than that. I have faith that human beings can love me even when it doesn't bless them. That's a risk that God takes on us, and Abraham is in the same position. But you see, God's gifts can become the biggest distraction we have to loving God. Our talents, our dreams, our careers, our possessions, our country, our church, even our family. Our wives, our husbands, our children, our parents, they can become more important to us than God himself. And when that happens, God says, you're going to have to sacrifice that. You're going to have to let that go. The mercy of God is severe. It's a severe mercy, as Sheldon Vanauken said many years ago. And it's not a pretty truth, but it is a truth that one by one, God is going to strip away everything you love, everything you've trusted, everything you've put your hope in, until there is nothing left but him alone. That job that you love, that career that you've poured yourself into, that identity that you've built around your profession, your occupation, is going to be taken away from you, because one day you're going to lose that job. You may get fired, you may get laid off, you may retire, but that job is going to be taken away from you. And everything that goes with it. And that is incredibly painful. 11 years ago, I gave up being a preacher. And it took me 3 years when I took the job I have now to figure out who I was, because I had always been the preacher, and now I didn't know who I was anymore. The dreams that you have for your ideal life, that plan that you have for retirement, that plan that you have for your marriage, that vision you have of who your children are going to be, you're going to have to sacrifice those, because it's not going to work that way. And there are going to be unexpected tragedies and harsh realities. Your marriage is not going to live up to your dreams. Your children will not be what you have expected, even if they turn out really well. Your children and your marriage are going to be sources of pain and struggle, because that's how life is. And you may lose your children before you die. You will lose your spouse one way or another, by your death or by their spouse, by their death. Your strength, your physical strength, your mental abilities, they are going to be taken away from you one little bit at a time. You're going to die by inches or all of a sudden, but it's all going to be taken away from you. My mama, my mother's mother, was a powerful woman. Bright, driven, accomplished, loved God, just one of those people that just went through life blessing people, taking care of people. She loved to entertain. She loved to have people in her house. She was an evangelistic person, and she felt a call to ministry, and there really wasn't a role for her as a woman at that time in our history. And so she convinced my papa to go into preaching, I think as much as anything, so she could have a ministry role with him. And they were like this power couple, and And she was intimidating. She didn't mean to be, but she was just genuinely better than you. She didn't come across thinking about herself that way, but she just, like, wow, how can anybody get as much done in a day as she could do? Until she was in her 50s, and 1977, she was afflicted with Parkinson's. And it's a cruel disease that just slowly takes away your abilities. It started with the inability to control that left hand. And then little by little, she lost control of her whole body, and it robbed her of her mind. And she spent the last 10 years of her life lying in a hospital bed, not knowing when the sun rose or set, being fed by ground up food, blended food in a medical syringe that my papa inserted into her mouth so slowly that it would take 3 hours to feed her. And when she was at that stage where she could still walk around with some difficulty, but she didn't know anybody's name, and we weren't really sure if she knew who we were, and she couldn't speak a sentence that made sense, and she lived with some delusions, and you couldn't leave her home alone because she might turn the stove on and forget it was on and then burn the house down. Or walk out the front door and be wandering around 3 or 4 streets over before you found her. When she was at that very painful stage, when she could do nothing else that made sense, she would walk around the house singing hymns perfectly. My Jesus, I love thee. I know thou art mine. It's the only thing she had left, and I still love that song. I never read 2 Corinthians 4:16-17 without thinking of my mama. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. See, God allows us to lose all of our loves to teach us that only He is worthy of our trust. And my mama taught me that even though everything else is taken away from you, you can still love God and trust Him. And it's the greatest gift she ever gave me. But without those tests in life, no one knows what they love the most, because it's in those trials where we become the people who can really trust God. Because until then, we don't have to. And trusting God's promise does not mean that you'll be protected from moments when it seems like those promises are impossible and God has turned on you. After all, we follow a man who died hanging on a cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And He said, "You must take up your cross and follow me too." And in the end, we find out that we own nothing. We control nothing. And the only thing that really matters is God alone. And He must be enough for us. But He is also a God who provides us with everything that He demands from us. What God would not let Abraham do, God did for Abraham and for us. This story doesn't end in Genesis. It ends on a cross where another son with wood on his back completes what God wouldn't let Abraham complete on the same mountain. Abram's torturous journey to Moriah ended in the deliverance of a death of Jesus, who became the ram caught in the bushes for us. And I wonder, would we really appreciate the story of the cross if we had not walked with Abraham up Mount Moriah and stood appalled at what God asked Abraham to do, and then realized that God did it for Abraham? God already did that for us. Could we understand what God did for us if we weren't first horrified that he might demand something similar of us, only to provide us with a substitute? Genesis 22 helps us see God's love for us is greater than any other love, and he proved it by sending his Son to the altar of death. His Son, the Son he loved, his only Son, Jesus. This is not a story that proves that Abraham was faithful. This is a story that proves that God is faithful. Occasionally, I talk with people who have experienced really unthinkable hurts. I told you last week about one of the refugees in Greece who came from Damascus in Syria, whose husband and 2 sons were killed in the war, and whose daughters were kidnapped by her mother-in-law, and who was left all alone. And yet, in spite of that, became a worship leader and said to us that worship is my therapy and the joy of the Lord is my strength. And I'm amazed by people who, despite incredible loss, understand the beauty and the goodness of God. And some stories, they're just unexplainable. Some years ago, I was visiting with a former prostitute who had been baptized in our church as a part of our ministry to homeless women at a homeless shelter. And she really had turned her life around. She had come to believe that God loved her, and she was on a good path. But then one weekend, when she was alone by herself and very depressed and really struggling, and all the voices of condemnation from her past came back, some old friend, acquaintance showed up with some drugs and tempted her, and she gave in, and then she kind of spiraled down, and the next thing you know, she ended up in jail. And I went to see her. And we sat there across plexiglass on phones talking to each other in the jail, and she began to tell me her story. When she was 4 years old, her grandfather began to rape her. That went on for years. And then her father and her uncle joined in, and that was just part of her childhood. That's how she grew up. Her mother knew about it, but when she asked her mother about it, her mother said, "They do that because you're dirty, it's your fault." And she internalized that. And so she decided as a teenager, if men were going to use her body that way, they ought to at least pay her for it. And so she started charging and turning tricks. And it was a way that she kind of got resentment against them. You're going to have to pay me for this. But she couldn't live with that choice sober. And so she would get high. She would get drunk, try to numb the pain that she felt, really believing on some level that she deserved this. And as she's telling me this story, she's just having tears stream down her face. And she looks at me and she said, "Why would God do that to me? Why would God let that happen to me?" What would you say? I've heard many such stories from people perplexed and angry at God and who've wondered how God could allow them to be hurt if he loved them. And I listen. I try to help. I try to be a presence of love for someone like that, but I can't always explain God. I can't. But even in a world of suffering, even with a God that doesn't always make sense, even in the most horrible stories, I can look anyone in the face and I can assure them that God loves them and God can be trusted. And how can I do that? Because God did for us what he would not let Abraham do for him, the unthinkable. Because in a world of senseless pain and unexplainable evil, God did not stand aloof and just watch us suffer. God came into our world. God lived in a body like ours. God experienced the hardship. God experienced the rejection. God experienced the hatred, the violence, the suffering. God experienced the injustice. God watched his son die. God was in Christ, redeeming the world to himself. God did the unthinkable. He did not exempt himself. He entered into our pain. He triumphed over it. And he offered us life through it and beyond it. And because he did not withhold his son, his only son, the son that he loved, Jesus, I trust him, even when I don't understand. So when our 5-year-old at the time, Abby, asked me if God would ever ask her to give up Baby Bear, I said, well, I don't think God will ask that of you, but if he did, would you do it? And she thought about it for a long time, and with total sincerity and great pain in her face, she said, yes, I would, but I sure hope he doesn't ask me to. And I said, yeah, me too, baby. I know. I know. But, sweetheart, God gave up something even more precious to him than Baby Bear is to you. And she thought a minute, and she said, you mean Jesus? And I said, yeah. Jesus was God's only son, and he loved him more than you love Baby Bear. He loved him more than you love me and more than you love your mama. And God let him die for us. So God must love us a lot, don't you think? And she nodded, still a little scared and clinging to Baby Bear very tightly. Still not convinced that he was safe from our demanding God. And I told her not to worry. And God would probably never ask her to give up Baby Bear. But that he would make her make some very difficult choices in life. That he would ask her to give up some difficult things, but that he would never, ever ask her to give up anything for him that he wouldn't give up for her. And that he would give her something back even more precious than anything she ever sacrificed for him. And so while she seemed somewhat relieved, I don't think she really understood what I was saying. But frankly, I don't understand it very well myself. I just believe it with all my heart.